Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On this week's show, we are looking at sex trafficking of children around the world and how the media covers this problem. In September 2012, the Times of London first reported that police in the English city of Rotherham had covered up a series of sexual abuses against children that took place from 1997 onward. The British government then commissioned a report to investigate the claims and to examine the police's handling of the allegations. The report was published in August. It found that at least 1,400 children had been victimized in Rotherham, and that both the police and the local government knew about the abuse, but did nothing to act on it. While this story attracted international attention for its scope and scale, it is sadly just one of many instances of child sex trafficking and victimization that takes place throughout the world. Journalists often struggle to cover these types of stories, not only due to sensitivity surrounding child sexual abuse, but because finding accurate information about the cases can be hard. Today on Global Journalist, we talk about the coverage of sex trafficking and sexual abuse of children and what the media can do to cover these stories properly. Given the nature of our discussion today, listener discretion is advised. Joining us today from Bangkok, Thailand is Steve Herman, Voice of America's Southeast Asia Bureau Chief, who has covered human trafficking and exploitation in the region. From Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, by Rodney Green of Messiah College, who researches sexual exploitation in India, and from Columbia, Missouri, by Clark Peters, an associate professor of social work at the University of Missouri, whose research influenced the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, which was signed into law by President Obama earlier this year. Rodney Green, I wanted to ask you, if you could, tell us just a little bit about the size and scope of sex trafficking of children in a place like India.
India has a very large-scale, complex problem of trafficking. It's within the borders of India as well as cross-border, mainly between Bangladesh and India and Nepal and India. And, estimates are between around 300,000 to 500,000 children being exploited in the commercial sex trade today.
Steve Herman, now you've written recently about the problem in Southeast Asia. We've known from reports that Southeast Asia does attract sexual tourists, including pedophiles. Why is that trade, why is it expected to grow, and why does it exist in Southeast Asia?
Well, it exists mainly because of poverty, obviously. And why it's expected to grow is because of the economic boom that's happening in this region. We're expecting from next year a formalized economic integration among the ASEAN countries, and that will bring more cross-border trade, skilled laborers and businessmen having an easier time of crossing borders. And the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and a report which has not been made public, says that will lead to a significant increase in the coming years in child sexual exploitation.
Rodney Green, and I just wanted to go back to you and ask you, why is it that this practice is so widespread? The numbers that you cited just in India are very, very high. Are there some cultural factors or social factors that contribute to this?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that contribute. Just like Steve said, poverty is a main reason. Poverty leads to, vulnerable systems and vulnerable families, and where there's subcultures of extreme gender discrimination, which could be religious or social, depending on where you are in India, leads to, women being seen as not as equal to men. Girls being seen as a burden to the family due to, future dowry and marriage kind of cultural practices. And so you see a combination of gender discrimination, poverty, leading to vulnerability. Other factors such as lack of law enforcement or corruption or just a large culture of wanting to make money. You'll see criminals or even just regular citizens taking advantage of vulnerable situations to make profit and to exploit migration patterns and anywhere you find a young girl in a vulnerable situation to make a profit.
And Steve Herman, I wanted to ask you, we've heard a little bit about the picture in India. In Southeast Asia, why is law enforcement not effective in policing this?
Well, you're assuming that there is law enforcement in all these places where these sort of crimes are occurring, and that is not the case. You have a lot of rural areas where there's scant, if any, law enforcement, and throughout the region, especially in countries such as Cambodia, law enforcement is corrupt. They may be involved either directly or indirectly, taking payoffs or helping to procure young victims for the trafficking and the brothels in these areas.
Clark Peters, in Missouri, if you could tell us just a little bit, what is sort of the profile of a child who may be sexually exploited in the United States, or somehow brought into pedophile rings? Is there one single profile of who is susceptible or vulnerable to this type of exploitation?
Well, listening to Rodney and Steve, the story is sadly similar, and that is it's drawn from poverty and vulnerable families that lead young people to get caught up into this process. I think so. That's the same. I think there are other dynamics at play, but certainly that's the key story right there.
And Rodney Green in Pennsylvania. Now, your research is focused on India. Now, the events in Rotherham, England, that attracted so much attention, many of the networks of men there were from the South Asian community in the UK. And I just wanted to ask you, do you see similarities between what happened in Rotherham and how children are trafficked in India?
I do see some similarities, especially in the realm of where there's extreme subcultures of patriarchal systems and leading to gender discrimination, where you have men who hold extreme power in family networks can really, there's a real lack of accountability. There's and I could see in systems like that men exploiting the system and exploiting people for sexual kinds of reasons or for profit financially to kind of feed that demand. So I do see similarities in the realm of gender discrimination being a factor.
Steve Herman in Bangkok, I wanted to ask you, you've written that there's a growing problem of online exploitation of children in places like the Philippines, where children perform sexual acts that are broadcast online. Can you talk to us about this phenomenon and how it can be stopped and why it seems so pervasive?
Well, this is obviously something relatively new with the advent of technology and better internet connections throughout the developing world. And there are a number of cases where law enforcement has found that children were being asked to perform sex acts on video cameras, which are witnessed by paying customers, usually in other countries over the internet. And this is also a problem that's likely to grow in the region, because in a lot of places where there has been the more traditional types of sexual exploitation of children, you don't have the broadband internet connections. But with the advent of 3G technology coming into almost everywhere now, the experts are predicting that these sort of crimes will grow in some of these more poverty-stricken countries in the region.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Today on Global Journalist, we talk about the coverage of child sex trafficking and exploitation and what the media can do to cover these stories properly. A recent investigation in Rotherham in the United Kingdom found that 1,400 children had been sexually abused by organized networks of men over a 16-year period, and that local police and local government had been aware of the abuse and done little to stop it. Sadly, it's just one of many instances of organized child sexual exploitation around the world, which is the subject of our discussion today. Given the nature of this issue, listener discretion is advised. Joining us today from Bangkok, Thailand is Steve Herman, Voice of America's Southeast Asia Bureau Chief. From Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, by Rodney Green of Messiah College, where he researches sexual exploitation in India. And from Columbia, Missouri, by Clark Peters, an associate professor of social work at the University of Missouri, whose research influenced the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, which passed through Congress earlier this year. For more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can listen to or watch episodes from our archive and read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Global Journ. Clark Peters in Missouri. Now, I understand that your research has focused a lot on the foster care system and how children are treated. How is it that children who have been engaged in prostitution are treated by law enforcement? Are they typically prosecuted as prostitutes, or are they treated as victims?
Less so now are they prosecuted. I think there's a growing recognition that these are victims, but I think that the dynamic, again, that we see internationally with regards to gender plays out differently here, but there's a common story, and that is there's a lack of understanding on the choices made by young people. I think sometimes there's a inclination to think that this is an activity done freely. This is the best choice, and sometimes maybe it is the best choice, but it's a law enforcement now recognizes that these aren't necessarily the victims aren't the places to focus prosecutorial attention, and we now go not only after the traffickers but also Johns, the actual the people who sort of avail themselves of these young people. But the story here isn't so much people seeking young children. A National Institute of Medicine report says that very, very few of those who actually engage in sex with young people seek sex with children, but rather they're seeking sex, and that there's not necessarily a taste. I mean, certainly they're out there. There's not a taste for young children, but rather young people are becoming prostitutes, and then they're the ones who are victimized by people who are simply looking for prostitutes. And I think young people are particularly vulnerable and more likely to get pulled into this, especially those coming from the child welfare system.
Rodney Green at Messiah College, could you tell us just a little bit about how law enforcement treats children, 15, 16, 17-year-olds in India when they break up brothels or break up sex rings? Are they treated as criminals, or are they treated as victims?
You know, it's improved in probably the last 10 years. I'd say about 10 years ago, majority were treated as criminals. The laws in India are quite interesting. You know, prostitution is kind of seen as, you know, it can be, if it's freely given, but it can't be within a public space. You know, that there's these kind of loopholes that exist. But in regards to, you know, the way brothels operate within public spaces and women on the street kind of advertising for that, you know, prostitution can always be kind of cracked down upon by law enforcement. And so for, you know, I think for many years, prostitutes and children and minors in the sex trade were treated as criminals. But that's begun to change, and there's a lot more awareness about what's called the ITP Act or the PETA Act in India, where there's special provisions given to children and kind of being able to be seen as victims. And so it has improved, but there's a lot of work to do. I've seen cases where it's you know, where it switches, you know, where they're seen as victims, and then all of a sudden they get switched to be charged and be as a crime, and so it's complex, and I think it depends on where you are and the state of that police department and the awareness and the state of the trustworthiness of that system and those particularly involved. It can kind of vary as you go along.
Can you talk to us too about what role that NGOs can play in a place like India? Part of what stands out about the case in Rotherham is that the sexual abuse went on for 16 years and seems to have been fairly widely known of within the community, within the local government, and yet nobody was saying, stop. What role do NGOs play in combating this?
NGOs can play a large role in from all the way from prevention to assisting law enforcement to assisting prosecution, rehabilitation efforts. So, NGOs play a large role, but especially in urban centers in India, providing accountability, providing assistance, filling in some gaps, where, law enforcement is not as well resourced. And so NGOs do play a large role, but where there's a lot more room to improve is in rural areas where NGOs need to be not only more equipped to deal with prevention strategies, but also with linking with the urban NGOs and being able to work together to confront this problem in a very holistic and comprehensive way.
Steve Herman in Bangkok, I wanted to ask you, how do local media cover this issue? You've been in Southeast Asia for some time. Do they run investigative reports like Dateline NBC and hidden camera stings about things like this, or is it something that's more generally accepted?
Well, I don't know. I would call it accepted. More, it's just been ignored in the media in most parts of the developing ASEAN countries are not as sophisticated as media in the Western world. That said, there are some exposés that happen from time to time. There are really gutsy reporters in places like Cambodia, in the Philippines, cases that tend to be publicized in the domestic media in countries here tend to be when a foreigner is caught with an underage girl. We've had some very high-profile cases that have taken place in Vietnam, and last week here in Thailand, a French man in his 40s was caught in the act in a hotel room with a 14-year-old girl, and his picture ended up in the newspapers. So there is some coverage, but among all the problems I think that domestic media are looking to investigate, this one is usually not at the top of the list because to a great degree it is hidden. It is dangerous to try to break up these groups, and there's maybe not a lot of incentive just to go out and try and cover these stories.
Now, do you get the sense that it's mainly organized crime in Southeast Asia that is involved in the sex trade generally and child sexual exploitation, or is it not something that is a mafia criminal type activity, but something that's more mom and pop?
There's definitely some of that, and I think we also have, especially in the countryside, a much more informal sector. But in the developing world, in Asia, money talks. And if you're a pedophile looking for a child, if you've got enough money to throw around, you're going to be able to victimize some child. You can usually also pay off the police if there's a raid. The brothels pay off the police. And so it is a question of money, but sometimes when these cases do get publicized by the media or embassies get involved, then there is a little bit of the rule of law, and that's also what agencies such as UNODC have been working on to better train law enforcement. In fact, there's a conference coming up here in Thailand next month, a 3-day regional training workshop where they'll be bringing in police and prosecutors and judges and social workers from 16 countries, focusing on how to respond to violence against children who come in contact with the justice system.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Today on Global Journalist, we talk about the coverage of child sex trafficking and sexual abuse, and what the media can do to cover these stories properly. Given the nature of our discussion today, listener discretion is advised. Joining us from Bangkok, Thailand, is Steve Herman, Voice of America's Southeast Asia Bureau Chief, who has covered human trafficking and exploitation throughout the region. From Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, by Rodney Green of Messiah College, where he researches sexual exploitation in India. And from Columbia, Missouri, by Clark Peters, an associate professor of social work at the University of Missouri, whose research influenced the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, which passed through Congress earlier this year. For more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can listen to or watch episodes from our archive, and read in-depth articles on international affairs and press freedom issues. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or join our LinkedIn group. Clark Peters, I wanted to ask you about the United States. What do you see as some of the problems children who are exploited sexually face later on in life?
I think that's one of the strengths of this, the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, is that it does take a two-pronged approach. I think some of the items, the dynamics that Stephen Rodney talked about is, it's good when prosecutors and law enforcement authorities pull back and don't re-victimize young people who are caught up in this process. But that's only part of the problem. That's just preventing one harm. You need to really shore up the prevention activities. And here in the States, the big pipeline into sexual trafficking comes from the foster care system. These are young people from families for a variety of reasons who really can't take proper care of them. So the idea is let's make sure that they're taken care of properly. The state acts in local parentis, sort of steps in to be parent, and we need to do a better job of caring for these young people. Their long-term prospects are bleak, but it goes beyond those sexually trafficked. And in fact, I think within the child welfare community, there is an ambivalence about journalistic coverage because this is a relatively small portion of the victims. The problem that breeds sexual victimization really touches on the lives of a lot of vulnerable young people with bleak prospects as they transition to adulthood.
Now, could you just give us briefly a sense of the size and scope of the problem in the United States? Are we talking about thousands of children or tens of thousands of children or hundreds of children who are?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I can provide an answer. In 2013, a national hotline counted just 3,600 kids, and that seems pretty trivial. But then you sort of pull back. There's one agency estimates that 1 out of 7 kids who run away, and there are tens of thousands of kids who run away each year, are victims of sexual exploitation. So part of the difficulty is, and here in Missouri and other Midwest states that I'm familiar with, there's it's difficult to know when to report this, and that's another strength of this bill to do a better job of that. But it's prosecutors are hesitant in part because the threshold for prosecution is quite high, and it's difficult to prosecute these perpetrators. And there is something to be done for the victims. So I think there's some help to be provided. There are, I think that's where the emphasis is, and sometimes ought to be if criminal prosecution is out of reach. That often means that those cases are underreported.
Rodney Green, I wanted to ask you, what more can be done in terms of international collaboration to stop this practice or to at least slow it? Is there more that needs to be done in the international arena? Is it more a question for national governments, for local civil society groups and nonprofits to do? What do you think should happen?
Well, one of the things that kind of came across in my research and in my own experience working in the anti-trafficking sector in India is that, just speaking from an NGO or nonprofit perspective, is that it's very difficult to collaborate sometimes. Even though the vision of human dignity and freedom is shared, often the methodology or some meanings are still contested in this arena. So collaboration can be very difficult. And so when you're looking at such a large-scale problem that exists across ethnic and language and national boundaries, you need it's more than one organization can deal with. So I often think that based on the research that I've done is that there are examples of NGOs collaborating and networks forming to confront this problem in a more holistic way, and that creates a stronger voice to work with the public sector and to see governments strengthen policy, to see law enforcement improve and systems improve, as well as the NGO sector having more of a cohesive voice to improve that system. And so, again, the principle is that the large, complex, and multifaceted nature of trafficking and the complexity of rehabilitation for survivors of sex trafficking and the trauma that they face, the economic challenges they face, the social stigma they face, that this needs to be done through collaboration across the civil society sector, from rural to urban areas, as well as with the public sector.
And Clark Peters, what steps can law enforcement, can policymakers in the United States be taking as we go forward here? What more can be done to slow or halt this practice?
I think there's two key things, and one is to make sure that we are taking care of these older, vulnerable young people more comprehensively and making a system that really serves their needs better. And the other is to continue the progress in collaboration between law enforcement and social services. Those really have to go hand in hand. In any country, and here in the States, we need to understand that simply pulling back on prosecution isn't serving what leads these young people down this path.
Steve Herman in Bangkok, I'll give you the last word with just about a minute to go. How is it the media should be covering this issue? What can we in the media, what can journalists be doing better to either highlight or cover this?
Well, the more stories that are done about it, obviously, the more knowledge and interest in combating the problem we will see. But it is a very challenging story to do. And as we found out recently, not all the NGOs involved in this in some countries are above board. And it's very difficult to get credible, reliable information about the scope of the problem, and then you have to be very sensitive about speaking with the victims.
That's all for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Our thanks to Steve Herman, Voice of America's Southeast Asia Bureau Chief, who has covered human trafficking and exploitation throughout the region. From Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, by Rodney Green of Messiah College, where he researches sexual exploitation in India, and from Columbia, Missouri, by Clark Peters, an associate professor of social work at the University of Missouri, whose research influenced the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, which passed through Congress earlier this year. Our executive producer is Casey Morell. Our lead producer this week is Taylor DeHaze, with assistance from Pablo Gabilondo, Mary Ryan, and Laura Welfringer. Travis McMillan from RJR is our technical director, and Pat Akers of KBIA is our audio engineer. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.